Our guest presenters are RIT professors Dr. Tamar, Carroll, and Dr. Christine Kray. Dr. Carroll is Associate Professor of History and a faculty affiliate in the Digital Humanities and Social Sciences, Museum Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies programs here at RIT. She is co-editor of Nasty Women and Bad Hombres, Gender and Race in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Dr. Carroll is also the author of Mobilizing New York, AIDS, Anti-Poverty, and Feminist Activism, and co-curator of the multimedia exhibition, Whose Streets, Our Streets, New York City, which ran from 1990 through 2000. Dr. Kray is Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Program Director of Sociology and Anthropology here at RIT. She earned her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and worked at Dartmouth College and Western Michigan University before coming here to RIT. A political anthropologist, she has examined cultural dimensions of colonialism, globalization, and resistance in Mexico and Belize. Her current research applies theories and methods of anthropology to illuminate some of the unspoken dynamics of power and resistance in U.S. presidential politics. We are thrilled to have both of our esteemed professors here with us today. Dr. Kray is first up. The audience is yours.
Hello, thank you so much. Tamar, Carroll, and I are very happy to be here with you today to share some of the highlights of our book. Our book is a co-edited volume with 28 contributions by scholars from a wide variety of disciplines, as well as journalists and essayists. Tamar and I will each speak for about 20 minutes, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, since we imagine you will all have quite a lot you want to say about the election. For my part, I want to tell you a bit about the book as a whole, and also discuss the research that I did at Susan B. Anthony's gravesite in Rochester on Election Day 2016. Tamar will then pull out key themes regarding gender and race that emerge from the book's essays. While I am speaking, you can go ahead and type in questions, some of which we will be able to address before I pass the baton to Tamar for her part of the presentation. So first, here's a polling question for you. Did you know about the mass gathering of about 10,000 people at suffragist Susan B. Anthony's grave in Rochester, New York on Election Day 2016? Now let's talk about the book. Why did we call it Nasty Women and Bad Hombres? You may remember this. At the third presidential debate on October 19, 2016, Donald Trump muttered under his breath, "Such a nasty woman," about Hillary Clinton. Earlier in the evening, when speaking about his proposal for a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, he said, "We have some bad hombres here, and we are going to get them out." Within minutes, a bad hombre Twitter hashtag had been created, and the next day, T-shirts and mugs with nasty woman and bad hombre were for sale online. Why did people seize onto those phrases? Those two phrases were recognized immediately not only as derogatory terms, but as phrases whose rhetorical force rests upon deep-seated cultural conventions and stereotypes that have aimed to relegate women and Latinos to subordinate positions within the U.S. social body. So Hillary Clinton was a nasty woman because she transgressed or violated cultural expectations of feminine submission. And when Trump spoke of bad hombres, he invoked stereotypes of Mexican criminality enshrined in Hollywood Westerns. That's why these two phrases form the title of our book. Together, they illustrate how gender and racial politics were at the center of the 2016 presidential contest between Trump and Clinton. But beyond examining gender and race in the election, our book takes it a step further and considers what we call the co-constitution of gender and race. By this, we refer to the ways in which ideas about gender and race emerge simultaneously in society as they are co-implicated. Here's one example that you may remember. When Donald Trump descended the gold escalator at Trump Tower along with his supermodel wife to announce his candidacy for the Republican nomination in June 2015, he said, When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. The claim that Mexicans are more prone to rape is an example of the co-constitution of gender and race, as it simultaneously, 1, depicts Mexican men as criminal sexual aggressors in need of containment, such as with a wall. 2, depicts white American women as vulnerable to danger, and 3, depicts white men as the heroic protectors of their women. The trope of the dark-skinned rapist threatening white women has a long history in the U.S. We've seen this before. It has been applied to different groups of dark-skinned men, including blacks, Native Americans, Muslims, and Mexicans. The idea that women are in need of men's protection is a key element in what Bell Hooks calls benevolent patriarchy, a kind of bargain in which women supposedly gain protection in exchange for submission to the men in their lives. The constraints upon women and people of color of a system of benevolent patriarchy are discussed in one chapter in our book by Jamia Wilson. Another unique feature of our book is that it is concerned both with history and also the historical imagination. The chapters on history trace how certain gendered and racialized policies, behaviors, and ways of speaking relevant to the election developed and transformed over time. Yet we're also interested in the historical imagination, which refers to how people engage with the past, including the stories they tell about it and intentional actions coordinated around its symbols and artifacts. The election was often called historic because it was the first time a woman received the nomination from a major political party for the office of the presidency. Yet the election also engaged the historical imagination, stimulating profound introspection and reflection on the nation's past, as well as its composition and values. The candidates strategically positioned themselves in relationship to U.S. history and to powerful historical icons. For his part, Donald Trump promised to make America great again, conjuring up nostalgia for the 1950s, a time of relative prosperity and privilege for white men. Hillary Clinton aligned herself with the suffragists at key moments, including by wearing white when she clinched the Democratic nomination on June 7, 2016. That's the photo in the top left. Again, when she accepted the party's nomination in July, that's top right. And at the bottom, again at the third presidential debate. For many, the election of the first woman president just short of a century after women gained the right to vote in 1920 took on the aura of destiny. In the middle of this tumultuous culture war and competing historical imaginations, citizens themselves turned to history to make the case for their candidate of choice, situating themselves within larger historical narratives and demarcating their communities of obligation, with gender and race as flashpoints. Rochester, where we, the book's co-editors, live, and public memories of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass feature prominently in this book. The idea for this book project began to develop in the summer of 2016 after I saw that Susan B. Anthony's gravesite here in Rochester was getting a lot of attention, as on primary day in New York State, that's the photo on the left, and then after Hillary Clinton secured the nomination, that's the photo on the right, and then after she accepted the nomination, people visited her grave, depositing gifts and leaving their "I voted" lapel stickers on the headstone. And that practice we've come to call the sticker ritual. So now I want to read the polling results. Okay, so the first, it looks like 3% of you were there, right, on on Election Day 2016 at her grave. 3% of you watched the live video stream. 31% of you heard about it on the news or social media. And 6% didn't go on that day but have visited the grave since then. And 6% have never heard about it before, and 51% no answer. So it looks like the majority of you who did chime in, right, did hear about it at least on news or social media, which is fantastic. So you'll have some idea, right, of what I'm talking about here. So for my part, since rituals are packed with symbolic meaning, I wanted to know what this new symbolic activity revealed about how women were reflecting on that unique political moment in which a woman might become president, while at the same time women were being admonished not to consider gender as a factor in their political choices. So in my discussion, I'm going to highlight 5 theoretical concepts: thunderous misogyny, inchoate expression, assembly, witnessing, and authenticity, and I'll take these in turn. So to begin, throughout the campaign season, Donald Trump performed what I call thunderous misogyny, by which I mean that he routinely expressed disdain for women while doing so in such a way that cowed women into silence. Trump railed against political correctness, giving license to men throughout the country to unleash vitriol against Hillary Clinton in ways that demeaned womanhood more generally. His bullying of Megyn Kelly, blood coming out of her, whatever, Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas, Ghazala Khan, quote, maybe she wasn't allowed to have anything to say, and Alicia Machado, quote, check out sex tape. All of these comments rested upon notions of the female body as polluting, cartoonish, wretched, and debased. Throughout the campaign season, some journalists had compiled lists of Trump's sexist comments and history of sexual harassment and misconduct, and all of this was before the release of the Access Hollywood tape in which he bragged about sexual assault and then the accusations of sexual misconduct by 11 women in the 3 weeks prior to the election, in addition to the several accusations already on record. Trump's alliance with Steve Bannon brought the invective of the Breitbart crowd into mainstream social media as commenters hurled misogynistic insults of cuck, snowflake, and beta, all terms implying that masculinity hinges upon dominance. Feminist concerns were shut down, as even while women increasingly recognized this misogyny, they were admonished that making it a political issue equated to narrow-minded identity politics. Trump accused Clinton of playing the woman card, and bloggers said that women shouldn't vote with their vaginas, somehow delegitimizing gender consciousness altogether. Once feminist concerns were hushed, gaslighting twisted the definition of reality as Trump claimed that, quote, nobody has more respect for women than I do, and that the Access Hollywood tape was just locker room talk. Disrespected, hushed, and spellbound by mendacity, many women retreated to Pantsuit Nation to talk with one another to reframe the conversation. But Pantsuit Nation was a secret group. The silencing had worked. Women were angry, but many shared their rage only in sheltered spaces. Trump's thunderous misogyny formed the context for the sticker ritual at Susan B. Anthony's grave. The sticker ritual had always been very small, and as you can see in this photo, on the day of the New York State primary in April 2016, by the end of the day, when this photo was taken, only 28 stickers were on the gravestone, which was the greatest number of stickers on the gravestone that had ever been documented in a single day. In other words, again, it was very small scale before the general election. On General Election Day in 2016, however, Somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people visited the grave. I was there interviewing people standing in line. Clinton was expected to win, and cemetery visitors were excited about the possibility of the first female president. Underneath that excitement were fear and loathing. Loathing of Trump's apparent disrespect for women and fear that he had changed the culture and made misogyny great again. In interviews, people talked about him curiously without using his name, like Voldemort, he who must not be named. Second concept, inchoate expression. Anthropologists are often drawn to rituals as they express, through the coordination of bodies, objects, words, and sensory experiences, a variety of sentiments and ideas. Ritual, as symbolic action, may entail few words, little self-referential exegesis. It's therefore a perfect vehicle with which to express inchoate sentiments, or things that people are only beginning to conceptualize, or sentiments forcibly silenced, just like feminist rage on Election Day. Although the gathering was at Susan B. Anthony's grave, the ceremonial actions were not really about her. Since French sociologist Émile Durkheim's book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, anthropologists have accepted that ritual totems, or the things that people worship in rituals, are really just symbols of the social group, and what people venerate when they worship the totem is the social group itself. We have to ask, what was the social group that was forming around Susan B. Anthony as a symbol? What were the cemetery visitors expressing about society through their actions? Third concept, assembly. In Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, Judith Butler observes that the embodied action of an assembly communicates more than the words that are used to describe the political action. The collection of bodies itself is an indexical sign of the right to assembly. People take up space. They affirm their right to the political. In converging upon the grave of the famous suffragist on Election Day, the cemetery goers affirmed their right to participate in the political process with concerns for women's rights. In fact, when I interviewed cemetery visitors about their motivations, they expressed that they saw Anthony as a symbol of women's rights activism. Common descriptors were brave, courageous, strong, tenacious, a fighter, and an American hero. Many emphasized that she epitomized not just a struggle for women's rights, but a broader struggle for human rights, for representative democracy, and human dignity. And the people gathered there were concerned as much with the rights of racial minority groups, religious minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities as they were with women's rights on that day. I need to acknowledge here that the question of whether Susan B. Anthony was racist is addressed in our book. I don't intend to downplay that here, but just to note that whatever she may have felt or expressed in her life, the visitors at the cemetery on Election Day seemed largely unaware of the charges against her, and they saw her as a symbol of rights activism more broadly. The ritual convergence at Susan B. Anthony's grave may have seemed an appropriate Election Day activity, therefore, to many Clinton supporters, as Anthony was someone who dedicated her life's work in order to secure people's rights. Anthony symbolized bravery when many felt the need to act bravely. By making a public display of standing with her and honoring her legacy, voters could imagine themselves as helping to bring about the fulfillment of her vision. They were saying not just, I'm with her, but I'm like her, or in this moment, through these actions, I'm a feminist too. Fourth, witnessing. Almost all of the cemetery visitors took photos of themselves at the grave to share on social media. The photo was part of the ritual action, as cemetery goers aimed to rebuild their social world. The ritual co-participants were witnesses to the symbolic act of standing up for equal rights. The ritual thereby became a vow or a social contract. When participants shared their photos of the sticker ritual with their social media contacts, they likewise converted those contacts into witnesses who would hold them accountable for the commitments symbolically expressed. Then finally, authenticity. The gravestone provided authenticity to what was for almost everyone a new ritual activity. Applying a sticker to the gravestone was a simple addition to a pre-existing ritual of depositing gifts at graves, and as such it could appeal to those who wanted to tap into something deep and abiding. In fact, the cemetery goers were not seeking something radical or revolutionary, but merely the fulfillment of the ancient promise of equal rights inscribed in our founding document. Gravestones symbolize time depth, the connection between past and present. They are firm, durable, grounded, embedded, ancient, sacred, even if worn and weathered by the elements. Gravestones persist. The grave site of a famous social activist was the ideal meeting ground for feminists who wanted to take a public stand in support of values that they considered to be ancient and non-negotiable, the dignity and rights of the individual. Okay, so we can take some questions now before I pass the baton to Tamar.
So one question we have would be, so we just completed, we just sat a new Congress, right? And during the midterm elections, as we now know, an overwhelming number of women were elected to office. So did you see this similar phenomenon surrounding that event?
I think that my read on it, and I know that Tamar is going to talk as well about the midterm outcomes, is my read is that this moment of Election Day 2016 and the campaign season that led up to it sort of was the beginning, really, of a new wave, right, of feminist action in the United States, and so that the sentiments sort of expressed around this ritual were mirrored elsewhere in the U.S., leading to the women's marches and then an enormous 2-year sort of campaign. Did you want to comment on that?
No, hold on.
Okay, right. She's going to say more about that soon.
Okay, so I'm jumping the gun here.
Okay.
I'm curious, and maybe Tamar will cover this too, but maybe this is too broad of a question, but how did we get here? How in 2019 are women being called nasty women and Mexicans being called bad hombres, and you know, it seems like we've come so far, but we've taken so many giant steps backward. Maybe that's too broad or not an appropriate question, but one many might be wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Donald Trump and I'll give some examples of this in a sec, but he very effectively employed identity politics, if you will, to court white voters. And so there's a real backlash after our first African American president, Barack Obama, being in office, concerns about the demographic shifts in the United States with the white population aging and becoming relatively less numerous, and frankly feeling some white voters feeling threatened by that, and also similarly men feeling threatened by, you know, women's advances in the workforce, for example. So I do think that I don't think this is permanent, but I think there was a real strong backlash.
And one question before we ask Tamar to take over. Based on everything you've presented, Christine, what is your personal thoughts or professional thoughts on how did all of these events and activities and and rhetoric, how much do you think they really impacted individual choice when it came to voting for a candidate in the 2016 presidential election?
I think there are lots of ways to look at voting patterns, and in addition, people often talk about sort of party affiliation, right, as being key, right? But we also know that motivation, right, and voter suppression are major factors, right, in how any one election tips in one direction or another. So if people feel, regardless of how they're registered, and right in the middle, right, there's a broad swath, right, of independent voters, right? So how any one election tips depends upon how motivated people are to get out there. And if they feel like there's support, right, out there, that there are other people who feel like they do, and there's a candidate who really represents some of the deeper feelings, right, that they have, maybe things that they've been afraid to say, they may get motivated and get out and vote, right? And then, but otherwise, right, if people feel sort of, right, depressed and marginalized and that their vote doesn't make a difference, or maybe really discouraged, maybe they've heard some, really negative things about a candidate, we have to remember that the Russian interference was going on, right, all along, that, right, if they, right, have been feeling sort of negative things about people out there, then they may just stay home, right? And that's what we saw with really low voter turnout.
Okay. Jason, I see your question, but we're going to hold it until Tamar does her portion. But I don't want you to think we're ignoring you, Jason. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. So our book explores how in American political culture, dominant white masculinity is associated with leadership. Donald Trump displayed this hegemonic masculinity through his emphasis on virility, power, willingness to use physical force, right, and to encourage his followers to use physical force, celebrating, for example, when one of his followers beat up a reporter, and the denigration of opponents. Those opponents who should have remained subordinate, particularly women and men who represent marginalized masculinities, including men that were non-white or physically disabled, have been frequent targets for Trump and his supporters. So in one of the chapters in our book, contributor Jane Caputi examined election paraphernalia such as bumper stickers and T-shirts, and she found that many pro-Trump examples emphasized his virility and the size of his manhood, literally. Okay, so he could emphasize his sexual prowess and have that work in his favor because he could avoid the associations of a predatory sexuality that are tied to men of color historically in this country, as Christine explained earlier, right? So he's able to brag about having large genitals without associations of lynching coming up. So that was one of the ways that race and gender intertwined in the election. And we see that also, as people were comparing President Trump to President Obama, and in the image on the left, comparing Trump as being more masculine and more virile than our previous president. Okay, so misogyny was a key term for us in this book. And in general, misogyny manifests not as a hatred of all women, but as a hatred of those women who step over the boundaries of femininity and take on the rights and responsibilities traditionally reserved for men, like being president, more broadly just being visible in the public sphere, taking part in politics, whether it's as a candidate or in Megyn Kelly's case as a journalist. Some of you may be following the current protests in India related to women of menstruating ages being allowed under court order to enter holy sites, right? And this has touched off huge waves of protests of women forming, a many hundreds of mile-long chain in support, and then protesters attacking women for trying to enter these holy sites. So this taboo on menstruating women is something that is cross-cultural and very ancient. And Donald Trump, perhaps subconsciously, I'm not saying he's even aware of doing this, but he taps into those biases and those long-standing feelings of disgust over women's bodies. And so that was why he talked about Megyn Kelly. He suggested that not only was she menstruating, but blood was coming out of her eyes and everywhere else on her body. So in discussing female opponents, Donald Trump focuses on their appearance and their bodies, and he uses these long-standing cultural tropes about femininity and the unsuitability of women to hold positions of power to buttress his own position. And to get back to the earlier question about, how can we be here in 2019, I think one of the things that makes these tactics so effective is that they do operate on a subconscious level, and they appeal to these long-standing cultural myths and stories that are embedded in works of literature, in the Bible, for example, so that we take them for granted, and they're activated on a subconscious level rather than in terms of the rational mind. So part of the challenge in the election, too, was that Hillary Clinton was not able to effectively attack Donald Trump for the sexual assault claims against him because of Bill Clinton's own history of charges of improper sexual conduct with women, including his intern, Monica Lewinsky, and the ways in which Hillary had defended her husband by attacking his female accusers. Okay, so one of our chapters explores the concept of slut shaming and how women who report rape or sexual assault are accused of having improper sexuality and therefore being responsible for becoming sexual victims. So because Hillary Clinton had defended Bill and because of his track record, it left her unable to effectively mobilize female voters' gender consciousness. Okay, so gender consciousness is awareness of women's political and social interests. And Hillary Clinton tried to do this by saying women's rights are human rights, and talking about things like health care and education, things that women historically have cared about, but that also would overwhelmingly benefit women. But she really was not able to fully activate gender consciousness. Never mind feminist consciousness, which is an awareness and critique of gender inequalities and patriarchy. Okay, so some voters do have a feminist consciousness, and clearly those that assembled at Susan B. Anthony's gravesite, many of them would fall into that category, or certainly into the gender consciousness category. But let's talk a little bit about Republican women, because majority of white Republican women did vote for Donald Trump. So we were curious as to why, because even though he had these pretty serious allegations of sexual assault against him, and even though he himself seemed to admit that he had approached women and even fondled them or groped them against their will, his support among Republican women didn't seem to drop. Okay, so they accepted his explanation that this was locker room talk. And one of our chapters, the contributors interview Republican women to try to get a sense of their feelings about the two candidates. and why they supported Trump. So part of it is because in the past, white men's sexual assaults have been generally accepted. That was one of their findings. So for example, a 67-year-old retired teacher and self-identified Republican voter explained, quote, "We know that locker room talk exists. We know that the loopholes are out there. We know that heckling whistles are out there. We know the looks are out there. We know that some of the gestures are out there. Are we happy about it? No. Do we live with it? Yes. And that's the way I'm taking this." So this voter and other Republican women accepted the argument that boys will be boys, basically, and they therefore depoliticized gender-related topics, especially those related to sexual harassment and assault, as being outside the scope of the political campaign and unworthy of attention. Okay, so this was a clear dismissal of the Clinton campaign's efforts to frame issues like immigration, foreign policy, health care as women's issues. Republican voters just did not perceive the election as being about women's issues. Instead, I would argue, Donald Trump actually was more effective in promoting gender consciousness for men and particularly for white men than Clinton was for women. So 52% of white women in 2016 cast their vote for Donald Trump. And similarly, Roy Moore in the Alabama Senate race in 2017, who was accused of sexual misconduct with teenagers, he nonetheless got 63% of white women's vote. Republican women were also the only demographic that increased their support for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh when he was accused of sexual assault during his confirmation process in October 2018. So time and time again, Republican women are unswayed by accusations of sexual assault. And we wanted to understand this better. One thing we've found is that women of all backgrounds tend to vote in the same way that their husbands vote. Partially, this is because women earn less money and hold less power and are therefore economically dependent on their husbands or on other men in their lives. So for married women, it's within their interest to support policies and politicians who will protect their husbands and improve their husbands' status. White men lean heavily Republican, and white women are more likely to be married than other groups of women, and most often marry within their racial group. So they're likely to be married, and they're likely to be married to white men. So this, in part, accounts for white women's greater likelihood to vote Republican. As Christine emphasized earlier, Donald Trump's campaign promised good-paying jobs in traditionally male sectors of the economy, mining, manufacturing, policing, and the military. And that promise would have appealed to white men and to their wives. And so in this way, Trump was effective in promoting gender consciousness among Republican voters, but for men, as opposed to Clinton's attempt to sway them to vote for her on the basis of gender. So Christine also touched on the concept of benevolent patriarchy, which allows conservative women to feel that if they submit to their husband's wills, they can benefit from their husband's protection and economic care. And another chapter in our book looks at Hillary Clinton's, looks at evangelical Christians' distaste for Hillary Clinton. She, in 1992, quipped, "I suppose I could have stayed at home and baked cookies," but instead, chose to pursue her profession as a lawyer and then as a politician instead. And evangelicals really took that comment to heart as an insult on traditional homemaking and never forgave her for it. So that was another big factor in terms of Republican women's attitudes towards Hillary Clinton. They just did not see her as reflective of their femininity or of their ideals of womanhood. Okay, so despite this, and despite the thunderous misogyny that Christine discussed, pro-Clinton women did create numerous intimate online publics. They used Twitter to oppose Trump. They formed the secret Facebook Nation Facebook page that Christine discussed. And even though these began sometimes as closed groups on social media, and so they were not public, following the first Women's March, which was the largest single protest in U.S. history and actually became a worldwide protest with an estimated 5 million people worldwide participating. The Women's March galvanized collective actions, including creating face-to-face meeting groups. They were initially called huddles, defined as small groups holding informal conversations. So we see a through line from the intimate online groups to the Women's March to groups meeting in person and encouraging women to run for office. So to pick up on the earlier question, do we see a connection to the record number of women that were elected in the midterm election this past November? Absolutely. So we first saw results in November 2017, so a year after Trump was elected. A record number of women candidates and their grassroots supporters led the Democratic Party to a surprise upset in the Virginia State House of Delegates. Then in December 2017, Black women's high turnout and basically uniform support for Democrat Doug Jones defeated popular Republican Roy Moore in the Alabama special election for U.S. Senate. A year after the first Women's March, a second Women's March was held with hundreds of thousands of protesters, again marching through cities across the U.S. and the world, including 300,000 in Chicago and 500,000 in Los Angeles. And the organizers of the Women's March selected Las Vegas in the key political battleground state of Nevada to launch their Power to the Polls rally, with a stated goal of registering at least 1 million voters in time for the 2018 midterm elections. And this gets to Christine's point about who is registered, who is motivated, who is able to vote. All of those things are important, and we did see a record turnout of young voters in the midterm election. A record number of women ran for House and Senate seats in the 2018 midterms, 330 Democratic women running and 93 Republicans running for House seats, along with 52 women running for the Senate. Ultimately, a record 102 women were elected to the House of Representatives, including 89 Democrats and 13 Republicans. This included the first 2 Native American women and the first 2 Muslim women ever elected to Congress. 15 women were elected or appointed to the U.S. Senate, making for a record 25 women currently serving in that body. So, a quarter of the Senate. So let's see, how are we doing? You know what, I'm gonna skip part of what I had planned to talk about so we can have more questions. Just to say that the Me Too movement is also a a powerful manifestation of women's anger and women's response to Donald Trump's election. And if we want to talk more about that in questions, we can, but I really want to, these are this is a photo from the second Women's March. Just think it's important, though, to also note the rise in white nationalist and white supremacist actions since the election. And I'm going to share with you very quickly some photographs taken by the photojournalist Mark Peterson. He won the 2018 Eugene Smith Grant in Humanistic Photography for this ongoing project about white supremacists in the U.S. The title is The Past is Never Dead. And some of these photographs were taken at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, okay, where violence was directed at counter-protesters, resulting in one death and numerous injuries. And in 2017, the FBI reported an increase of 17% in hate crimes, including a 37% increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes. Okay, and that was before the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, which was in 2018. So we don't have the official statistics for 2018 yet, but we know that that hate crimes have continued to rise. And so the rhetoric really matters. In the aftermath of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, for example, David Duke, the former leader of the KKK, said that the march there fulfilled the promises of Donald Trump to, quote, take our country back. And President Trump was slow to disabuse people of that view. He blamed many sides for the violence in Charlottesville instead of denouncing white nationalism, including anti-Semitism. So in thinking about the future, we think it's really important that all of us make use of critical history to interrogate the past and reject false public memories, those that frame white women as victims in need of protection from Black and Mexican rapists, and that we really dismantle rhetoric related to white supremacy and hegemonic masculinity so that we can preserve human rights for everyone in this country. We have an upcoming related conference, March 28th to 29th, in which many of the contributors to our book will speak, and we invite you to register and to come to that. It is open to the public, and our book is also available for purchase online through the University of Rochester Press and through Amazon. And we have some time remaining for questions.
Okay, thank you, ladies. Please put your questions into the chat box. We have the question Jason entered earlier. So for one or both of you, doesn't matter. Do you think Hillary Clinton's loss is more attributed to her career reputation, or was it predominantly patriarchal sexism? And part two, would a different female candidate have achieved the same success, or similar success, or success in general?
Wow,
that's a loaded one, lady.
That's right. We got about 300 pages with commentary on that. Yeah, would a different woman do differently? I don't know. I think already we've seen that Elizabeth Warren is first out the gate to announce her candidacy for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2020, and one of the first opinion pieces that came out in response to that, to who her announcement was in Politico.com, in which the question was raised, is she likable? And immediately, right, people began to sort of criticize that piece, saying essentially that's sort of the wrong question. And it's really sort of a sexist question at heart. That women and men are often judged differently, and so the question of likability is more often asked about female candidates. And a lot of people said, let's just not talk about likability and let's talk about policy positions and preparation for the job and other things like that. So, yeah, I think that's a good response.
So if you go to the University of Rochester Press website, you can read one of the short chapters in our book by Joanna Weiss, which is titled The Impossibilities of Hillary Clinton as a Self-Made Woman. And briefly, Weiss argues that because of her marriage to Bill Clinton, it was impossible for voters to perceive Hillary on her own terms, and to that both younger women and older women distrusted Hillary because of her marriage to Bill. So, I think any woman candidate is going to face misogyny, is going to face dismissal because of gender politics in this country, but I do also think that Hillary had some unique baggage that definitely influenced voters' response to her, perhaps simply in suppressing or moderating Democrats' enthusiasm, because we saw a lot of young voters in particular being more excited about Bernie Sanders than they were about Hillary Clinton. And, if they had come out in the same numbers as they had for Barack Obama, she likely would have won.
Would you say that gender politics, as you discussed them, would be, I don't know what the right terminology is, but would it be comparable to some of the birtherism stuff that Trump start that, with President Obama? So isn't that kind of the same concept but different? I don't know how else to phrase the question, but.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. I mean, they're both suggesting that the person is not a legitimate leader, not fit for presidential office. And yes, absolutely, Donald Trump has a long history of using race and racism, whether it was in terms of in New York City, the Central Park case in which he continued to accuse young men of color who were falsely accused of raping a white woman even after they were exonerated. He continued to say he believed that they were, the ones that had raped her. And then, yes, denying that, demanding to see Barack Obama's birth certificate and suggesting that he was not legally qualified to run for office.
Absolutely, and that just to go back to that phrase that I used earlier about the co-constitution of gender and race, I think, right? You talked about gender politics and birtherism, and the way that I read that is right is that you're talking sort of about how misogyny, right, on the one hand, or loathing against women, right, and bigotry in various forms, right, can run similarly. They're both ways of discounting, discrediting, diminishing, and otherwise sort of rendering abject one's opponent. And Trump effectively, I mean that he did it well, right, or he succeeded in what he was trying to do, not that it was good that he did it, but he often, what I call sort of engendered race and racialized gender. He used race and gender simultaneously, right, as ways to discredit and diminish. Right?
Are these events and these activities Do you envision that they are purposeful, that there are literally advisors sitting around and strategizing about how to use gender politics and race and other things that to discredit and delegitimize a candidate? Is this all done intentionally, do you think? Or is this just who they are, and you can't hide who you are, and it just all comes out?
I think sometimes it's intentional, and those of you that were following coverage of President George H. Bush's funeral might have heard about the Willie Horton ads that he ran against his opponent, then Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, which featured an African-American man who was on parole when he murdered a white woman. And that was an ad that intentionally conjured up this long history of fear of black men as being menaces to white women in particular, and suggested that Michael Dukakis had failed to protect white women by allowing Willie Horton to be paroled. That was a calculated call to appeal to racial politics that George Bush's campaign advisors made. So there are times that we know for a fact that racial or gender politics are purposefully invoked. I think other times, I don't think anyone, this is just my guess, I don't think anyone told Donald Trump to say that there was blood coming out of Megyn Kelly's whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that may just be subconscious on his part. But Christine, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because sometimes we're talking about Trump himself, and sometimes we're talking about, the campaign, which is lots of people sort of behind the scenes talking and collaborating. But I recall one of the last ads in the Trump campaign before the election was a sort of scare tactic ad, and it featured three prominent Jewish donors, to Democratic causes. George Soros among them, who's often sort of held up as sort of a boogeyman almost, someone to be really afraid of in terms of his influence, in Democratic politics, because he's such a wealthy man and committed to Democratic causes. And so this scare tactic, featured three Jewish men, as sort of being a threat. And what are the chances, then when you're holding up examples, of people to be afraid of, you pick three billionaire Jewish men, I mean, to me that seems like somebody was making a calculated effort there. And that's just one of them.
So thank you to both Dr. Carroll and Dr. Kray for their time today, and thank you to all of you out in our audience for tuning in. If you, we have a lot to think about, and this is a very large book because I'm looking at it from across the table. So if you're inspired with another question, please email them to ritalum@rit.edu, or you can tweet them to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, and we will direct your questions directly to our panelists.